In previous episodes we focused on the Soviet space program with the Sputnik and the flight of Yuri Gagarin, the first human in orbit. But the Americans didn't want to stay behind and started working hard to catch up. In this episode we're going to see the world from their perspective during the beginning of NASA's manned space program.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Let's travel to the past for a moment. In the 1950s, the United States developed a rocket plane called X-15, which could reach speeds of up to 4,000 miles per hour. The X-15 flew many times until the late 60s. 7 of those flights were piloted by a guy called Neil Armstrong. With the creation of NASA on July 29, 1958, the Mercury Program began. This program selected a group of young pilots, the best and most professional pilots in the US Air Force, to become astronauts and go to space. This group was known as the Mercury 7.
These men, the nation's Project Mercury Astronauts, are here after a long and perhaps unprecedented series of evaluations which told our medical consultants and scientists of their superb adaptability to their coming flight. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury Astronauts.
The names of the chosen pilots were Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Dave Slayton. From then on, the press followed all their steps and they were frequently in the news. They were especially interested in John Glenn, who was already famous since he piloted the first intercontinental supersonic flight. NASA also recruited many aerospace engineers and flight controllers, including Wernher von Braun's team, as well as hundreds of experts in many fields of science with one goal: to figure out how to take a man to space and bring him back safely. At that moment, many of them knew nothing about rockets, spaceships, or how orbits work, which we reviewed briefly in the first episode. Between them was Gene Kranz, a man who would become a great leader in mission control and a key person in the American space program. The future astronauts were put to all kinds of tests like the ones seen in the movies. NASA wanted to make sure they were physically and mentally prepared. By that time, rocket technology wasn't as advanced as it is today by far. Explosions were frequent, and that worried the astronauts and engineers. For that reason, making safer rockets became priority number one. In the early 60s, NASA developed the single-seat Mercury Capsule, which would be used in all the missions of the program. However, doctors doubted that human beings could function correctly in space due to zero gravity. As no one had done it before and the human body is designed for Earth, it wouldn't be surprising if it was hard to breathe, swallow, or any body function really. After many tests, the spaceship was ready to be used on top of a Redstone rocket designed and modified by von Braun and his team to launch the capsule on a suborbital flight from Space Launch Complex 5 in Cape Canaveral. That's a flight to space, but not to orbit, because the rocket can't accelerate the capsule enough due to its mass of almost 2 tons. The most important of those tests was the launch escape system. For that purpose, NASA developed the so-called launch escape towers, which would be on top of the spacecraft. In case of an emergency, they would activate and take the capsule far enough from the rocket to open the parachute. These towers can be used before and during the flight. Back to the astronauts, NASA had chosen John Glenn, Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom for the first flight. However, the decision of who would go first was a huge surprise for all of them, and that's because the chosen one was a chimpanzee called Ham. It was a tough decision, because they wanted to beat the Soviets in sending the first man to space and they didn't know how much time they had. But it was made to make sure, once and for all, that zero gravity wasn't lethal. So, on January 31st, 1961, Ham the chimp was launching the Mercury Redstone 2 mission. Ham passed all tests and landed exhausted, but healthy, so the mission was successful. There was no doubt, human beings were prepared for a trip to space. Kerolev's team had a much more powerful rocket than the Redstone, the R-7, capable of launching a heavier payload than the Mercury to orbital speeds. But they knew that the public didn't understand the huge difference between space and orbit, so they hurried up to have it ready before NASA. Some months later, Alan Shepard was chosen to become the first human in space, with the launch scheduled for May 2, 1961. Unfortunately for him, just 3 weeks before the launch, news arrived that the Soviet Union had successfully put Yuri Gagarin into orbit. The Soviets behaved in a completely different way to the Americans. Instead of making their space flights public as national propaganda, they kept them an absolute secret until they were finished so that the Americans had no time to react. The secrecy was such that the images of the launches that they made public were false, not to reveal any details of the rocket or spaceship's design. As we saw in the previous episode, on April 12th the Soviets put Gagarin in orbit, but there were some details I didn't add not to make the video too long. Let's say the mission had some difficulties. Problems began when the retro thruster turned off a few seconds before it was supposed to. The automatic system detected it and prevented stage separation of the capsule so as not to leave Gagarin without supplies until re-entry, which could have taken days to happen if the engine hadn't fired. The problem is that the engine fired just a few seconds less than it was supposed to, which made the landing site different, but re-entry was imminent anyway. In the end, stage separation happened in the last second, when friction with the air burned some cables that kept them together. But trouble didn't end there, because after a successful re-entry, Gagarin nearly landed in the huge Volga River, and the heavy equipment he was carrying would have made him drown. But of course, as the ejection to land, those details were not disclosed until many years later. Everyone in the US was disappointed to have been beaten again by the Russian rivals. John Glenn said, "Let's face it, they've beaten the pants off of us. Now let's all go and let's learn how to fly in space." On the other hand, Alan Shepard was disappointed, but determined to become the first American in space.
Project Mercury is just one part of the endeavor toward space travel. I quite personally am intensely interested in it and just delighted to have been given the opportunity to participate.
On May 5, 1961, everything was ready for Alan's 20-minute-long mission. 45 million Americans couldn't stop watching TV, and hundreds of them stacked in nearby beaches to see their hero entering his capsule called Freedom 7 and venturing into the unknown. But the launch was constantly delayed due to technical problems, and 4 hours after entering the capsule, Alan needed to pee so badly that he started getting nervous and asked to be taken out. The answer was no, so he asked for permission to urinate in the suit, which he finally did. That didn't make the flight controllers especially happy. The launch wasn't delayed anymore and Alan decided that it was time. So they did it. Just before liftoff, he had something to say to his colleagues in mission control. Don't fuck it up. When the engine stopped, Alan could feel the zero gravity, but he didn't have much space to move around inside the tiny Mercury capsule. It was so small that the astronauts had an inside joke. They didn't get inside of it, they put it on. The apogee of his trajectory was 187 kilometers and, after reaching it, he started falling back to Earth. As it is a suborbital flight, the re-entry is short but very violent, so they use the retro thrusters to slow down a little bit. As always, the plasma that forms around the capsule prevents any communication temporarily. Even though Jury beat him to space, Alan does actually hold the record, because his mission was the first manually piloted spacecraft and the first crewed suborbital flight. A few weeks later, the President John F. Kennedy gave an unforgettable speech.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. We shall send to the moon a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out. Then we must be bold.
He challenged the nation to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely before the end of the 60s, and they hadn't put one in orbit yet. The countdown had begun. They didn't know if it was possible, but they were determined to try it. 2 months after the first, they launched a very similar mission to make more tests, and it was a success with one exception. After the splashdown, water started filling the capsule and it almost sank along with its pilot, Gus Grissom. The one to blame was a system to quickly open the hatch from the outside in case of an emergency, so it was eliminated from future spaceships. He was finally saved in the last minute, but the capsule sank and all the valuable data it contained was lost. The Liberty Bell 7 capsule was recovered from the bottom of the ocean in 1999 and is now exposed in a museum. A few weeks after that, in August 1961, the Soviets launched the Vostok 2, which was very similar to the Vostok 1, but it performed 17 orbits instead of just one. This mission focused on real investigation in contrast with the other one, which was just a show of power. The pilot of this mission was German Titov. The Mercury program was on the right path, but they still hadn't accomplished their main goal of putting a man in orbit, and the Soviets claimed their superiority. NASA needed a more powerful rocket that could do what the Redstone couldn't, putting the Mercury in Earth orbit, so they adapted the Great Atlas rocket for this purpose. The American public loved him, so John Glenn was selected for the first flight. After months of hard work, the Atlas Space Launch Complex 14 was adapted for this purpose and the development of the modified Atlas was completed. Everything was ready, and on February 20, 1962, John Glenn entered his Mercury Capsule, which he baptized Friendship 7. He waited for the end of the countdown as 100 million people watched it live on television. He orbited the Earth 3 times in 5 hours, but not everything worked out well. When he completed the first orbit, Mission Control detected that the heat shield had loosened. This meant that the only things holding it to the ship were the ropes of the retro thrusters, so if they were detached, the heat shield could be lost as well, and the spacecraft would disintegrate in the atmosphere during the re-entry. They didn't tell John not to worry him, but when he was asked if he felt any shake or bounce, he knew something was wrong, and they weren't telling him. They then told John not to detach the retros during re-entry, and when he asked why, they told him that it wasn't important, just the opinion of Mission Control. The idea was for the ropes to hold it until friction with the air was enough to keep it still. After that, he would detach them in the middle of re-entry in a risky maneuver. For as long as the plasma caused communications to be lost, it was impossible to know if the ship had endured the re-entry or it had turned into many little and hot pieces. This is the original Friendship 7 capsule, which carried John Glenn to orbit. Even though the Atlas rocket was a bit less powerful than the R-7, the Americans had reached the Soviet Union and the space race was now tied. John Glenn had become a national hero once again. Similar flights were conducted afterwards, more focused on investigation for future missions. The next one to be launched was Scott Carpenter, then Wally Schirra, and finally Gordon Cooper. This was the first step to fulfill Kennedy's dream of going to the moon, but they still had to learn a lot about working in space and develop the technology required to do it. With that goal in mind, the Gemini program began, which would be an intermediate step between Mercury and Apollo. If you want to know what they achieved, subscribe, hit the like button, and get ready for the next episode of the story of space exploration. Very soon on Planet Genesis.